Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about Jonah. No matter who you are, you're probably familiar with his story. He was swallowed by a whale as commanded by God, and he has a really short book in the Bible, but it's really impactful. Our man's Jonah is a prophet, right? So he's sent by God to send a message to the city of Nineveh, which hosts a lot of power, but also a lot of corruption. And at this warning from God that he has to send, he's scared. He's scared to make himself vulnerable in this act of obedience, and so he runs. God obviously is God. He is sovereign. He has his way, and he catches up with Jonah, of course. And so through Jonah's fear, he's placed in a position where he has to surrender. He literally has to be thrown into the ocean, surrender to death. He's swallowed by a whale, which is the grace of God protecting him in this unconventional way. And while he's in the belly of the beast, he prays a beautiful prayer to God. God hears him in this position and he's revived. But after all he had been through, right? After he vowed to God to keep his covenant, to be obedient, to give the message to Nineveh, he shares the message. Nineveh heeds the warning, right? You would think he'd feel like a champion at this point, like a bona fide prophet. But no, Jonah finds himself feeling humiliated, defeated, ashamed, frustrated with God because he was looking with his earthly eyes at the situation. And what his earthly eyes said, what the enemy lied to him and said, was that now, since you told Nineveh what God told you, which is within 40 days, his wrath will be shown upon the land. But because they turned, because they repented from their evil ways, and God showed mercy and compassion on them, now you gonna look like a liar. Now you look crazy. Now you look like you were speaking in your own might. Now you look like you don't know what you were talking about. Because he boldly paraded through the city for 3 days, saying what God had told him. So what happens when you find yourself in that place where you're standing on a promise from God? You're sharing what he told you to share, but God is sovereign and it doesn't go according to the plan that you had in your own mind. Jonah had a really open dialogue with God in his book. He said, "See, God, didn't I tell you?" That's his tone with God. "I wanted to stay home. I know that you're abounding in mercy and compassion. So if you weren't gonna put wrath over these people, why did you have me go and run through the town and tell them? I could have just stayed home instead of putting myself out there. That was so scary, and now I'm humiliated, God." So God, he continued to be compassionate with Jonah, and he just approached him like a son. He said, "Is it right for you to be angry?" And he gave him examples of why it wasn't, right? But before we get into that, let's break down Jonah's position in this moment after he's completed the assignment but feels like an imposter for it, right? His whole thing is he wanted to just stay at home. Why even do the work if it's not going to yield the outcome that I wanted, right? Which is me not looking like a liar in this situation. We know that God's not a man that he should lie. So if Jonah was sent by God, there ain't no way he could look like a liar, okay? In Jonah 3 and 5, it says, after that Jonah gave the warning and the Ninevites heeded, it was because they believed God. Nowhere in the book does it say they believed Jonah. Nowhere in the book does it say that they thought Jonah was a liar. It said that they believed God through the prophet Jonah and repented and turned from their evil ways and were better for it. God showed his mercy on them for it. Here's the tea though. If Jonah would have stayed home, like his own will and his own might wanted him to, he would have been less safe, less covered, and less protected than he was in the belly of the beast, where God placed him after he ran. If he would have went straight to Nineveh, he would have been safe, obviously, because that's where God sent him. But even in his detour, even in the detour of his flesh, he found himself in safety because God sent a whale to swallow him up, not to kill him, but to host him, to cover him, to hold him in that moment while he would pray, while he would get his heart and mind in agreement with God, and then to vomit him out so he could go complete the assignment. Because here's the backstory. Jonah's a Hebrew from Israel, right? And at this time, as foretold by the prophet Amos a couple books before, at this time, at the time of Jonah, Israel was a place of wickedness, pride, arrogance, greed, sinful nature, complacency, and hate. Okay? So God told Israel through the prophet Amos, it is a ripe time. Check the book out, y'all. He shows Amos a bowl of ripened fruit, and he says, it is a ripe time for me to bring destruction upon Israel. How many of you know that there are spaces and places and groups that you want to stay in because it's comfortable, because it's familiar? But if you were to stay, you'd be part of the destruction that God is bringing to that space for his glory alone. So where he's sending you, which is uncomfortable, which is vulnerable, which is scary, which is out of your wheelhouse, if you look with your earthly eyes, is exactly where he needs you to be, under his covering, because you are his chosen one. God really wanted to drive home the depth of his compassion to Jonah. And so as Jonah sat on a hill, lamenting in his anger, his frustration, and his humiliation, wishing to die, overcome by suicidal thoughts because of his public humiliation, which he internalized as humiliation, right? God gave him compassion. So Jonah built a shelter for himself to be covered from the elements, right? And so he's like, okay, I'm gonna sit here in the shade and be upset. That's my whole plan. Don't talk to me. And God sends a leaf to cover him better than the shelter he built himself. And I'm gonna leave that alone. I'm not even gonna really get into that. Okay, boom. God sends a leaf. And so he's covered, right? Then God sends a worm to eat up that leaf that he sent, which was the supreme covering. And then he sends a storm, which blows his shelter away, and he's so uncomfortable that his feelings of discomfort and unease are amplified, and he wishes to die even more. Now, God doesn't say, I'm mad at you and I'm removing my favor from you because you have these intense feelings that are causing you to be suicidal. No. He shows up with compassion and a word and presence. Hallelujah. And he says, is it right for you to wish to die? And God is saying in this story to Jonah, I sent you the covering. And now you're mad because it's gone when you did nothing to make it sprout. I have compassion on the people of Nineveh because I created them. As I was reading through this book and receiving from God a message for his people that find themselves in a position like Jonah, where you stood on a word from him and you find yourself in despair because you're humiliated, because it didn't go the way that you thought, okay? So if that resonates with you, this is what God is saying. You feel that your reputation was diminished, but he needs you to make yourself small and humble enough, right? Imagine how small and humble Jonah felt in the belly of the whale as he prayed his prophetic prayer in loyalty and gratefulness to God, right? Can you make yourself small and humble enough to realize that God's sovereignty and God's compassion are greater than your feelings? Not only that, but because you are a messenger of the Lord, because you are a chosen prophet who he trusts with his sacred word, with the breath of life, your reputation could never be diminished because your reputation is in him. He never fails. He goes before you. He put the words in your mouth. He told you to write the book. He told you to write the vision and make it plain. So it's not your reputation, but the Almighty's. What Jonah thought was his destruction did not add up to the reality of the situation. Like I said, nowhere in the book did it say that the Ninevites thought Jonah was a liar. Jonah thought that the Ninevites thought that Jonah was a liar. You see where the math ain't mathing? He had a negative projection of himself that he placed onto others. God knows the reality. He's sovereign. He knows the reality of the whole entire situation before he sent Jonah. He didn't send him to be humiliated. In fact, he was never humiliated. He had that conception within his own mind. He was still learning to fully yield to God. He'd receive a prophetic word, then run. Then he'd surrender and be humbled and do what he needed to do, but then he would retreat into himself, into his dark thoughts, right? So we see him struggle, we see him battle, and I know this resonates with some of us here today. He goes on to share that his compassion is not just for Jonah, but it's for the lowest to the highest of the people of Nineveh, including all of the animals. God cares. He has a heart for us. God's grace and compassion will not pass you by. He won't forget you as you're sharing your gifts, right? As you're doing what he asked you to do. He's not going to bless those people through you and forget you. He has enough mercy for you as well, for all of Nineveh and the Nineveh in you.